I raised those two kids on my own, fed them, clothed them, drove them to school every single morning for 8 years. And when my son finally came back with a lawyer and a court order, he told a judge I'd stolen them from him. I still think about that moment in the courtroom. The way he sat there in a pressed shirt, looking like he'd never done a wrong thing in his life, like the night he drove away from my farm in Elora, Ontario, with nothing but a duffel bag and a promise to be back in a week, never happened at all. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I've worked this land since I was 22, and I know what it means to keep a promise. My son, Trevor, never quite learned that lesson, though Lord knows I tried to teach him. Trevor was my youngest. His mother passed when he was 14, and I think that broke something in him that never fully healed. He drifted through his 20s, construction jobs that lasted a season, friendships that burned fast and ended badly, a gambling habit that started small and grew into something I didn't recognize until it was already enormous. By the time he was 28, he owed money to people I didn't want to know about. I'd bailed him out twice. The second time cost me $40,000, money I'd saved over 20 years of cattle farming and crop sales. I told him that was the last time. I meant it. He met Diane the following spring. She was bright and funny, and I liked her immediately, which is why it hurt so much when things went the way they did. They got married in my backyard on a Saturday in June, and I remember thinking that maybe this was the thing that would settle him. Maybe this was what he needed. They had a daughter, Lily, in the first year. Then a son, Caden, 18 months later. Trevor was working a steady job at a millwork shop in Fergus. For a while, maybe 2 years, things looked genuinely good. They rented a place in town, the kids were healthy, and Trevor seemed like he was finally building something real. Then the gambling came back. I didn't know how bad it had gotten until Diane showed up at my door on a Tuesday afternoon with both kids in the backseat of her car and a bruise along her jaw that she didn't try to explain. She didn't have to. I'd seen my son's temper before, though I'd never seen it touch someone he was supposed to love. I made her tea. We sat at the kitchen table while Lily and Caden played in the living room, and she told me everything. The debt, the loan sharks, the night he'd come home drunk and put his fist through the wall beside her head. She said she was leaving, that she had family in Vancouver she could go to, that she just needed a few days to get organized. She asked if I could watch the kids for the week. I said, of course. That's what you say when your grandchildren need you. You don't calculate it, you don't negotiate, you just say yes. That was 8 years ago. Diane never came back. She called twice in the first month. The second time, she told me she'd enrolled in a nursing program, that she was getting healthy, that she'd send money when she could. She sent $200 in an envelope with a card that said, "Thank you." After that, nothing. I hired a family lawyer in Guelph named Margaret, a quiet woman with sharp eyes who'd handled custody matters for 30 years. She helped me get emergency temporary guardianship of Lily and Caden, a process that took 4 months and required Trevor to be formally notified, which meant finding him first. He was in Calgary by then, from what I could gather. He signed the papers without a word. For 8 years I raised those children on this farm. Lily learned to ride a horse before she learned to ride a bike. Caden helped me fix fence lines from the time he was 6, handing me tools and asking questions about everything. I drove them to Laura Public School every morning, helped with homework at the kitchen table every evening, made it to every school concert and parent-teacher interview, coached Caden's hockey team for 3 winters running. I was their grandfather. I was also, in every way that actually matters, their father, my neighbor Ray, a man who's farmed the property adjacent to mine for 26 years and who I'd trust with my life. He became like a second grandfather to those kids. He'd take Caden fishing on Saturday mornings and let Lily help him tend his kitchen garden, teaching her the names of every plant. When I had to go into town for supplies or appointments, Ray was the one who looked after them. We had an understanding, Ray and I. He knew everything about how I was raising those children, and he'd have told anyone who asked exactly what kind of home they were coming from. Their teachers knew. Their pediatrician at the Wellington Health Center knew. The Hockey Association knew. The whole community of Elora knew those were my grandchildren and that I was raising them because their parents had left. So when the black SUV pulled into my driveway on a Thursday afternoon in September and Trevor stepped out wearing clothes I'd never seen him in before, expensive clothes, the kind that say someone's been spending money they didn't earn slowly, I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. The feeling you get when you see a storm coming from far enough away that you know you can't outrun it. He had a man with him. The man carried a briefcase. Trevor didn't look at me when he got out of the car. He looked at the house. "I want my kids back," he said. I asked him where he'd been. He said that didn't matter now. The lawyer, a man named Cliff, who talked quickly and seemed allergic to silence, handed me a document right there in the driveway, an application for full custody, filed in Ontario Superior Court. The document alleged that I had taken the children from their father without consent and refused to return them. It used the word unlawfully 4 times. It did not mention Diane. It did not mention the gambling debts, or the bruise on her jaw, or the signed guardianship papers, or the 8 years of silence. I stood in my driveway holding that document for a long time after they drove away. I called Margaret that same evening. She'd semi-retired, but she remembered my case immediately. She listened to everything I told her, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you still have the original guardianship order?" I had everything. That's something people who've never dealt with the legal system don't always understand. Paper matters. I had the original guardianship order signed by a family court judge in 2017. I had the signed consent forms from Trevor. I had 8 years of school records, medical records, receipts, correspondence. I had a folder in my filing cabinet that Margaret had told me to keep from the very first day, and I had kept it faithfully. "Good," she said. "Bring all of it." What I didn't anticipate was what Trevor had been doing in the months before he showed up. He'd apparently told people in the community, people I didn't know well, people on the edges of things, that I had taken his children during a mental health crisis he'd experienced and had refused to let him see them during his recovery. A story with just enough shape to sound plausible to someone who didn't know better. He'd contacted the local Children's Aid Society with a complaint. He'd spoken to a reporter at a regional paper who, to their credit, hadn't run anything yet but had made some calls. And two people I had known casually for years, neighbors of a neighbor, people I'd waved to at the fall fair, had provided written statements supporting Trevor's version of events. I don't know what he told them or what he offered them. I just know that when Margaret showed me those statements, I had to sit down. The Cass investigation was the hardest part. A worker named Sandra came to the house twice. She interviewed me. She interviewed the children separately. Lily was 14 by then, Caden 12, and she reviewed the documentation. I want to be clear about something. Sandra did her job properly. She interviewed those children with care and without leading them, and what they told her was the truth because they'd lived it and because they're honest kids. But the process itself, the waiting, the not knowing, the feeling of being examined in your own home to determine whether you've done right by the people you love most, that is its own particular kind of suffering. The morning of the first court appearance, I woke up at 4:30 and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. Caden came downstairs at 5, still in his pajamas, and sat down across from me without saying anything. He was 12 years old, and he already understood more about this situation than I wished he had to. "Are we going to be okay, Grandpa?" he asked. I told him yes. I said it like I meant it, because you have to, because a child asking that question deserves an answer without hesitation in it, even when hesitation is the honest thing. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been up since 2, that my hands had been shaking since I opened that custody application, that the farm I'd worked for 40 years suddenly felt fragile in a way it never had before. I didn't tell him any of that. I just made him oatmeal and drove him to school and went to meet my lawyer. Margaret had prepared a response that laid out the full chronological record, the temporary guardianship order from 2017, Trevor's signed consent, the absence of any contact, not a phone call, not a birthday card, not a single message in 8 years, school records going back to JK, medical records, a letter from the Children's Hockey Association, a letter from their school principal, a woman who'd known both children since they were small, who wrote in plain language about the home environment she'd observed over 8 years. She'd also obtained an affidavit from Ray, 3 pages, handwritten in his careful way, detailing everything he'd witnessed from the day Diane arrived at my door to the present. Ray is not a man who uses words carelessly. Every sentence in that affidavit was exact and true. The thing about Trevor's lawyer, Cliff, with the briefcase and the fast talking, was that he had built an argument entirely on the absence of documentation that he assumed I didn't have. He had assumed, I think, that a farmer in his 60s wouldn't have kept careful records. That assumption was the foundation of everything he'd constructed. And when Margaret began presenting our evidence, I watched Cliff's expression change in small but readable ways. Trevor sat beside him, looking straight ahead. The judge, a woman named Justice Kowalski, who had a reputation in Wellington County for not tolerating wasted time, asked Cliff to explain the discrepancy between his client's claim of non-consensual removal and the signed 2017 consent forms. Cliff asked for a brief recess. Justice Kowalski gave him 10 minutes. They came back. Cliff spoke more slowly after that. What emerged over the following 2 hours was the architecture of Trevor's actual situation. He had, it turned out, come into money, an inheritance from a great-uncle I'd never heard him mention, roughly $80,000. He had spent most of it within 18 months. He was now in a new relationship with a woman who had 2 children of her own, and his lawyer, I learned this later through Margaret, had advised him that pursuing custody of Lily and Caden would be more likely to succeed than it should have been, given that the original guardianship order had technically lapsed without being formalized into permanent guardianship. That was a real gap, and it was the gap Trevor had been coached to exploit. Margaret had anticipated this. She'd filed for retroactive permanent guardianship as part of our response, supported by the full evidentiary record. It was, she told me quietly outside the courtroom during the second recess, the strongest case she'd made in 30 years of family law. Justice Kowalski did not make her ruling that day. She took the matter under reserve, which means she took time to review everything before deciding. That waiting period, 11 days, was the longest 11 days I can remember. I went through the motions of the farm, fed the cattle, maintained the equipment, cooked dinner, helped with homework. Ray came by twice, and we sat on the porch without talking much. He brought a thermos of coffee the second time. That's the kind of friend he is. On the 12th morning, Margaret called me before 8. She had reviewed both applications thoroughly, she said, and granted me permanent legal guardianship of Lily and Caden, with my existing care recognized as continuous and uninterrupted since 2016. She dismissed Trevor's custody application entirely. She also noted in her written ruling, and this mattered to me more than I expected, that the children's own accounts of their home life had been consistent, detailed, and credible, and that both had expressed clearly where they wished to remain. There was more. The Cass investigation, having found no grounds for concern about the children's welfare in my care, referred Trevor's conduct, specifically the statements he'd made to initiate their investigation, which they determined to be materially misleading, to a further review. I don't know exactly what came of that. Margaret told me it was no longer my concern and that I should let it go, and she was right. What happened to Cliff, the lawyer, I also don't know in detail. Margaret mentioned in passing that his approach to this case had attracted some attention from the Law Society of Ontario, particularly around the statements filed regarding the original guardianship arrangement. I did not press for details. Trevor didn't call. I didn't expect him to. I still don't. There is a version of me that grieves that. The version that remembers the boy who used to follow me around this farm, asking questions about tractors and cattle, who cried when his mother died and let me hold him even though he was 14 and thought he was too old for that. I don't know what happened to that person. I hope he finds his way back to something decent for his own sake. But I stopped waiting for it. The two people who'd provided statements supporting his version of events. I saw one of them at the co-op in Fergus a few months later. She didn't say anything to me, and I didn't say anything to her. I buy my feed and I go home. Some things aren't worth carrying. What I do carry, what I will carry for the rest of my life with something that I can only call gratitude, is the memory of Lily's face when I came home after Margaret's call. She was at the kitchen table doing homework, and she looked up when I came to the door and she read whatever was on my face before I said a word. She got up and she hugged me and she didn't let go for a long time. Caden came in from outside a few minutes later, still in his barn boots. And when I told him, he nodded once, that serious nod he has that sometimes makes him look 40 years old, and then he went very quiet and looked out the window at the fields. "This is our farm," he said, not a question. I told him yes, this is our farm. Ray came for dinner that Friday. I made roast chicken the way his wife used to make it, with the potatoes done in the same pan. We ate without a lot of ceremony, the four of us around the table where I've eaten 10,000 meals. And afterward, Lily asked Ray to tell the story about the time he and I tried to fix the north fence line in a February ice storm in 1999. And neither of us will admit whose idea it was. He told it better than I would have. We laughed. The kids laughed. The kitchen was warm, and outside the fields were going dark in that particular way they do in early November in Ontario, that deep blue-gray that I've looked at my whole life and never gotten tired of. I'm 63 years old. I've got 2 grandchildren who know how to work hard and treat people honestly and find something worth laughing at on an ordinary Friday night. I've got a farm that's still standing. I've got a neighbor who showed up when it mattered. That is enough. That is, if I'm being truthful, more than enough. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Cudden sitting across from me at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, still in his pajamas, asking me if we were going to be okay. He was 12 years old. He shouldn't have had to ask that question. And the fact that he had to ask it at all is something I've thought about more than I've admitted to anyone. I don't believe the world is run by luck. I've farmed long enough to know that what you put into the ground determines what comes back up. Trevor made choices. Not one big choice, but hundreds of small ones over years, and those choices built a life that eventually collapsed under its own weight. The gambling, the debt, The morning he drove away and left two children on my doorstep, with nothing but a duffel bag and a silence that lasted 8 years. None of that was fate. It was the accumulated result of a man who kept choosing the easier thing, the dishonest thing, the thing that felt like relief in the moment and cost him everything in the long run. I'm not saying that with bitterness. I'm saying it because I think it's true, and because I think the truth of it matters. What carried me through wasn't luck either. It was the folder in my filing cabinet that Margaret told me to keep from day one, and that I kept faithfully for 8 years. Every record, every form, every letter. People sometimes talk about intelligence like it's something you're born with. But the kind that actually saves you in hard moments is quieter than that. It's paying attention, it's asking the right questions early, it's understanding that the paperwork nobody wants to deal with is exactly the paperwork that will matter most when things go wrong. I was a farmer with a grade 12 education, and I built a legal case that a 30-year family lawyer called the strongest she'd ever made. Not because I'm exceptional, because I was careful. And then there's Ray. 3 pages of handwritten affidavit, every sentence exact and true, from a man who didn't have to do any of it. He showed up because showing up is what he does. I think about what this story would have looked like without him, without someone willing to stand beside me, not because it was convenient, but because it was right. That kind of character doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of choosing, quietly and without fanfare, to be the person other people can count on. Lily and Caden grew up watching all of it. They watched me keep records and honor commitments and ask for help when I needed it. They watched Ray show up. They watched, in the end, what happens when you build something honest and defend it with everything you have. I hope that's worth more to them than anything I could have said. I hope when they're grown and their own hard moments come, and they will come, they'll remember that the farm is still standing, that we didn't lose it, that we fought for it the right way and we won. That is, I think, the only thing I ever really wanted to teach them.